Good evening all and welcome. As a special treat, I've collaborated with the channel Dark Echoes for the first story. It is entirely acted out professionally, accompanied to my narration, so instead of a dark screen, you can watch the first story if you wish. And if you like what they do, be sure to check out their channel, which will be linked at the end and in the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I got into trouble in high school, my evangelical aunt gave me a startling wake-up call by sharing the most harrowing story I've ever heard. The story of her exorcism. I'll never forget the look of disappointment on my mother's face the day I got suspended from high school. It was the first time I'd ever really acted out. I was the new girl at a pretentious Christian school. My father got a better job, and my family moved midway through the school year. Being an introvert by nature, I struggled to join any of the already established social groups. My parents pushed me to get involved into the after-school clubs, but I found my classmates to be just as cliquey outside the classroom as they were inside of it. And then, in a single moment of weakness, that all changed. I was taken in by a group of kids who'd best be described as the wrong crowd. They weren't particularly bad by society's standards, but this was an expensive private school with strict religious tenets. They drink and smoke and ditch class and generally rebel against the school's lengthy code of conduct. And while this wasn't the type of kid I'd normally associate with, I was desperate for belonging. One day, there was a school-wide assembly, and my new friends and I ditched it to get buzzed and go play with a Ouija board. We were deep into consulting with the spirits about our celebrity crushes when a janitor walked in on us. Between my suspension and my drinking, I knew I was in for some tough love at home, and I deserved it. I fell asleep in the car when I woke up. We weren't at our house. Instead, we were 2 towns over at the church where my Aunt Maggie worked and lived. My Aunt Maggie was one of those crazy zealots who ate, drank, and breathed evangelical Christianity. She wore homemade dresses that covered her from head to toe and had a giant pocket to hold the tattered Bible that she kept on her at all times. The weirdest thing she did was refer to herself as we and us long before preferred pronouns became a commonplace. I assumed it was because she believed Jesus was always by our side. I wish I still believed that. My mother left to run errands, and my aunt and I made small talk as I braced myself for the inevitable sermon. She started it with, "You probably think of us as prude, but we weren't always like this. We used to be just like you." And then, she did something completely unexpected. She unzipped the top of her turtleneck dress and revealed that her neck and chest were completely covered in tattoos. I was blown away when I saw the ink, and then she quickly zipped it back up and began her story. She explained that she left home to go to beauty school when my mother was still a toddler. She lived the fast lifestyle of drinking, drugs, and dabbling in the occult. One night, a few years into her hedonism, she woke up to see a dark, malevolent force coalescing above her. She thought she was having a nightmare and tried to shake it away, but she couldn't. As the entity neared, she instinctively knew that it meant to take control of her body, much like the demons that Jesus cast into the Gadarene swine. She summoned every ounce of her will and reached for a Bible that she kept on her nightstand, not one that she read, but one that she profaned as her candle holder. As she struggled to fight against the malevolent force, she could feel it pouring into her body like the sands of an hourglass. A heaviness enveloped her. It felt as if she was pushing her arm through wet cement. for an object hopelessly far away. The moment she touched the Bible, the entity was divided. The bulk of it was driven away, but the part that had already invaded her body remained. As she lay there clutching the Bible against her chest, she heard a resounding guttural voice that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It said, "I inhabit you now." My aunt paused for a moment and realized how tense I was. I was not prepared for such a compelling story. She took a sip of her tea, and then unfastened the pouch on her dress and took out her Bible, the very one she'd grabbed onto so many years before. She explained that her battle with the demon had only just begun. She was bedridden for days after the first night, locked in a struggle that tested her physically, emotionally, and spiritually. On the third day, the family's pastor called on a colleague to perform the rite of exorcism. She explained that the entity reacted violently to the exorcist's presence. It made her writhe and buck as the priest demanded for the demon to exit her body. The spiritual battle lasted for hours. The exorcism had a young assistant that sat silently in the corner until a surprising moment when he spoke the name Oribus. The demon instantly recoiled. The exorcist began repeating the name over and over until my aunt's body contorted upwards and the invader withdrew. He floated over her for a long moment and then lifted her off the bed into a pool of darkness. As she hovered there for what she said felt like hours, but the exorcist said was only a few seconds. In that darkness, the demon spoke to her in a language incomprehensible to everyone else, and then it released her. At that point, my mum returned to pick me up, and my aunt gave me a hug goodbye. Neither my mother and I said a word on the drive home. I sat in the back and wondered how much of what my Aunt Maggie said was true, and how much of it was some wild fabrication designed to scare me into making better choices. In the end, I wasn't willing to risk it. I stopped hanging out with those friends, stopped acting out, and vowed to never touch a Ouija board again. A year later, my aunt sent me a package. Inside was simply a copy of a cassette tape and a note that read, "If you ever wanted to know why I use plural pronouns, listen to this, but only if you're feeling strong of spirit." My film studies teacher had a vintage Walkman in his office and agreed to let me use it. The next day, I brought the tape to school and played it during class.
This is a recording from my...
I'll never forget what I heard.
Exorcism.
It was the poorly recorded audio of her exorcism.
As I'm sure you know, I was born before we moved to the US. The voice you hear is in the dialect of my hometown, of Oppdal.
Den som snakker sannheten. Den som gir ditt land.
You could clearly hear a horrifying voice that spoke what sounded like gibberish. Then my aunt translated what was said.
The English translation of what was said is, "I am the speaker of truths, the conferrer of titles. You will never be free, for I am eternity."
I cried as I realized that the we she referred to wasn't Jesus. It's the demon that lies dormant inside of her, waiting for her to falter, so it can once again take dominion. I've slept uneasy ever since. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, you could get a metal bracelet with the name of a soldier that was a prisoner of war or missing in action in Vietnam. The idea was to wear it until they got home as a show of respect and honor. The only info you would get was their name, rank, and their birthday. I'd been wearing mine for about a year. It was 1973. My mum had a friend over for dinner, and our table conversation turned to the occult and the Ouija board. After dinner, we pulled out the board, and my mum's friend and I sat knee to knee and put our hands on the planchette. She asked some questions and it moved. And I was sure she was doing it because I knew I wasn't. After a while, we asked whose spirit we were communicating with. The reply was the name of the soldier on my prisoner of war bracelet. Remember, I had no info on him and didn't know he was a prisoner of war. A bunch of weird stuff then happened that I won't go into because it would take long, but suffice to say it convinced me that neither of us were making up what was happening. The spirit told us he was killed during a secret, clandestine mission over the enemy lines and said his remains couldn't be found for many years. He then said when they were found, he'd be returned to his family in a mid-sized town in Texas. Fast forward to 1995, 23 years later. My soldier was still unaccounted for. He hadn't been a prisoner of war. An article came out in a newspaper. The remains of 5 soldiers had been discovered and identified. They were killed when their helicopter was shot down deep in enemy-held territory. My soldier was one of the 5. His remains were being returned to his family for burial in Waco, Texas. I then broke my Ouija board in half, threw it out, and won't go near one again. Who knows what doors might get opened up? I hope the soldier is at peace. When I was young, I had an imaginary friend called Alice. She was very twisted, and I imagined her being some sort of misunderstood but definitely evil being. I didn't have any other friends, so I'd sit alone outside at recess and talk to her. My peers would tease me and ask who I was speaking to. I always said nobody, and never ever told anyone about her. But one day when I was 6 or 7, I accepted that she wasn't real, and she ended up going away after I told her so. I did not hear anything from her for 2 or 3 years, and never told anyone about her. When I was in 6th grade, my new friends and I all decided to play with a Ouija board during gym class, and I was faking the board for a while, trying to scare them and getting away with it. I got up and didn't say goodbye because I didn't take it seriously. All of my friends shouted at me, and I said that I would be right back before going to the bathroom. So I'm walking out and Noah runs up and shouts at me, "Alice wants you." What? I don't know, but I was told to tell you Alice wants you. Now I'm on edge, but perhaps it was just a coincidence. Then she described herself, and they're all asking me who the hell Alice is, and I'm saying she's nobody. But I'm now taking it a bit more seriously. We ended up saying goodbye, and the following night my doors slammed a few times on their own, and just felt like I was being watched. I've always gotten a lot of nightmares, but ever since then for years I've gotten them 4 or 5 times a week, and it's really weird. I don't believe in the paranormal, and haven't heard from Alice since the board, but it does make me question what Alice really was. For context, I live in a house next to a road. It's fairly busy depending on the type of day. My family and I don't like it much. It's always very loud with the ruckus of cars. I never had a bad feeling towards our house nor the road. But one day, this experience happened just as I got off the bus. It was all to do with the drunk driver that was hit in a car accident. This was right across our driveway. The car was in horrible condition and looked like it got T-boned. Everyone on my road was told what happened except me and my sister. But we lost interest and didn't care the next day. It's been a few years since that happened. About 3 years ago, my mum, sister and I went to our local shopping centre, bought groceries, Lego, and while I was in the toy aisle, my mum came over to me. I don't know how, but there, in the toy aisle, was a Ouija board for sale. I was a bit surprised. She was excited, but a little nervous. My sister came over. She was excited and a little nervous. I was always a scaredy cat. Fake videos on YouTube convinced me that a demon was going to come out and kill my whole family if I even looked at one of these things. So of course I was cautious. My sister insists that we do it. My mum was even on board, weirdly enough. So we took it home. It took us a few nights before we actually used it. And when we did so, we invited my cousin to play with us. My cousin was all hyped. He was the kind of kid who was brave and always wanted to try something out. When the time came, we gathered around our dining room table and turned all the lights in the house off. The only thing lighting up the place were these nice-smelling candles my mum bought. We all hesitated for a while before starting and asked if it was here. It took a while before the planchette moved to yes. Everyone looked at the board excited, except for me. I'm relatively sure I was going to pee myself. We asked it for its name. I think it said something like Jason. We asked it the question quite early on. How did you die? It took about a minute to respond when it spelled out C-A-R. My mum immediately withdrew her hand from the planchette and said, "All right, I'm out." We asked her why she stopped. She looked at us for a second and then started to talk. So, when that car crash happened, the drunk driver's name was Jason. He had been drinking and driving when eventually he hit the car right in front of our house. The police came to apprehend the driver, but he had died on impact. The police say they saw a light figure wearing overalls, and as the incident was next to our house, perhaps he was attracted to the board. Safe to say the game ended that night, and I don't think I'll be playing with it again, as I don't want to invite the spirit of Jason where he isn't welcome. This is a true story that happened to me around 8 years ago. I was 13 and my sister was 14 or 15. Before I get into this story, I need to give you some insight to what was going on in the months prior. My sister had learnt about Ouija boards and had become addicted to playing with one that she made herself. It was a very simple board made out of paper. Every day she'd sit on the floor in her room while I played video games in the room across. Sometimes she would ask it very specific questions and then tell me the answer. One day I was talking with my mum outside in the front yard when we heard a loud moaning coming from the upstairs window, my sister's room. My mum laughed a bit and yells up, "Hey, what are you doing?" No answer, just more moaning. We both head inside and walk upstairs to see what she's doing. My mum attempts to open the door to her room, but it's stuck. She starts pushing hard to get it open and says, "All right, this isn't funny, open the door." Finally, she's able to wedge it open enough to peek inside, and she sees my sister laying on the floor foaming at the mouth and making strange noises. My mum screams and dials 911. I peer in the room and see a homemade Ouija board laying next to her body. Paramedics show up and says that she had a seizure and take her to the hospital. They do every test under the sun on her and conclude that she's perfectly healthy. She'd never had a seizure before, and she has no underlying issues that could have caused it. A few weeks later, she tells me exactly what happened. She had been playing with the Ouija board that day, and she said the piece of paper was acting stranger than usual, and moving very quickly when she would ask it a question. It kept telling her to take her clothes off. Then the piece started making extremely fast and random movements, and she heard multiple voices start chanting, "The devil is here, the devil is here." Her body then completely locked up, and she laid there in terror, and soon after everything went white. She's never had a seizure since, nor, as you can expect, has she ever touched a Ouija board. My neighbour was 4 years older than me. and she always had me over her house to hang out. She was even kind of a babysitter for me a lot of the time. Well, one day, she had another friend her age over and myself, and they presented a Ouija board, and that it was used to speak to ghosts or something like that. Apparently she had done this before, because it seemed she knew exactly how to set up the area. She lit a bunch of little disc-shaped candles, turned down the lights, and we all sat on her bed, which was against a wall. I'm a little hazy on the specifics, but after asking a few questions like, who is here, why are you talking to us, and then more advanced ones that I can't really remember, the Ouija board started to move her across the bed and up the wall. We still had our hands on the little glass thing, as somehow the whole assembly worked its way onto the wall and started rubbing vigorously against it. She turned on the lights and blew out the candles, and the board stopped and fell to the bed. I remember her dad flipping out the next day because the board left a huge black imprint on the wall and he had to paint it. Who knows? Perhaps it was just her and her friend who had thought up this elaborate prank. But she never told me in the years I knew her it was a prank. We're no longer in touch. I may ask her on Facebook. But the thing on my mind is if anyone else has ever had any strange Ouija experiences like this one. Growing up, I was always fascinated by the paranormal. My mum and I watched The X-Files and Tales from the Crypt together back from when I was in 1st and 2nd grade, though that stopped when my dad moved back in with us around the end of the 4th. Right before my dad moved back in, my little brother was rummaging around in the attic and found an old Ouija board that my mum had owned when she was in her 20s. He brought it down and insisted we play. Though I had always been interested in the paranormal, I never really wanted to meet a ghost, and I'd been going to a youth group at my church every week, so I was thoroughly convinced this thing was a portal straight to hell. I refused to play it with him. After a whole lot of whining and begging, my mum relented and sat down on the floor with him. About 20 minutes went by as they sat on either side of the board with their fingers on the planchette and nothing happening. When my mum gave up, my brother promptly resumed begging me. After seeing them just sit around this piece of cardboard for so long with nothing happening, it became almost comical to me, and had really lessened the fear I had of it. I finally agreed, because it would make him stop bothering me, knowing full well nothing would happen, and I'd be up in a moment when he got bored. So I sat there, and as soon as my fingers touched the planchette, something happened that didn't happen with them. It began to move. Being an older sister, and knowing my mischievous little brother, I immediately smack him and accuse him of moving it, which he denied. We fight about it, eventually getting back into the board. This time though, both swearing that we're not moving the planchette, we put our fingers on it and it starts to move again. So going with it and secretly hoping to talk to my grandma who passed away not long before, I ask, "Who are we talking to?" The planchette moves to W and stops for about 10 seconds and then slides down to the very bottom of the board where, in tiny writing, it shows the Ouija board is copyrighted to a William Fuld. The magnifier on the planchette then settles on the tiny writing of his name William and slides off the board completely. My brother and I are both looking at each other, mouths agape. Then I start thinking, well, what kind of person would know that their name starts with W, but possibly not know how to spell it? So then I ask, how old are you? The planchette moves to 4, so I ask, when he died. The planchette moved to the numbers 1, 8, 5, and 4. Caught up in the moment, I followed with the question of how he died, and it just spelled out sick. At this point I'm thoroughly freaked out, as is my brother, though he isn't being very vocal about it. We then tell William that we're leaving now, and move the planchette to goodbye. I have never used it before. Over and over we went to goodbye, and then out of pure fear I think my brother closed the Ouija board with the Xbox and the planchette still sitting atop it. And after flat out refusing to go to the attic, he shoved it in a cubby in the bottom of our entertainment center under the TV. At this point I'd like to mention that before using the Ouija board my brother noticed it was very dusty. So he went and got Pledge furniture polish and sprayed it down, make it squeaky clean, so that when the planchette did move, it felt like it would make a very eerie squeaking sound. Fast forward an hour or two and my brother had gone to bed. I am sitting watching TV in the living room with my mum when she decides to turn in. About 5 to 10 minutes after my mum goes to bed, I start hearing this sound. I nearly wet myself when I realize it's coming from the direction of the TV/entertainment center, and I can hear it over the sound of the TV. So I mute the television and just listen. I'm hearing the felt feet of the planchette squeaking over the Ouija board in the box in the entertainment center. Now, as a kid who's been going to church and has God in her heart, I tried to show no fear by putting on a comedy show and turning the volume up as loud as I could while reclining in my chair. I set up the sleep timer on the TV to turn off in 4 hours. The next thing I know, I'm waking up to an infomercial, and then I see a 30-second countdown pop up, and then the TV turns off. Rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and to my horror, I realize I can hear the squeaking. I get up and run like a shot to my mum's room, and curl up with my mum to sleep for the night while praying. Fast forward a decade or so and I'm in high school. I have my first girlfriend, and I'm in my first serious lesbian relationship. When my mother's mental state begins to slip, her condition worsens within a few months, and she went from saying that I would always have a home with her no matter what, to one day, if you're going to live with her, you need to leave. On this particular day, I grabbed my toothbrush and some clothes and walked with my girlfriend to stay at a friend's house a few blocks away. Upon getting there, I realized I'd forgotten a bag of weed. I was stressing about it so much I had to go back and get it. It was around 11:30 p.m. I snuck back to my house. My room was in an enclosed patio, so I had backdoor access, as I hopped the fence into the backyard. As I'm approaching my door, I start to hear this child's voice. The only way I can describe it is it sounded like it was being said right into my ear, but from down a long hallway. And the voice was saying, "Mommy, Mommy, help me, Mommy," over and over. As I got closer to my bedroom door, it got louder, and I realized it was coming from the window of my garage right next to my bedroom door. Immediately, my rational brain kicked in, and I thought it had to be a neighbor's television, or even my own mother, having another episode inside. I walked around the house and looked next door to see my mother through the window talking. I should say, jumping up and down, gesturing wildly. Mimicking was her thing at this point to her sister who lived there. I then walked up and down my entire street looking at houses to see who still may be up, and all the lights were off. Every house was dark. I realized I wasn't hearing the sound anymore, and as I get to my backyard, closer to the door, I start hearing it again. "Mommy, help me, Mommy." I then ran past the window, entered my room, grabbed what I needed and bolted back across the yard and over the fence. I think my threshold for crazy stuff that day had been hit hours ago, and I couldn't handle to investigate further what was going on in the garage. As time passed, that long ago experience with William crossed my mind. I was able to reflect on the whole situation with the less emotional involvement. I can't help but wonder if it was due to my, perhaps even my whole family's, fragile state at the time, and that's how he was able to make audible contact. There were no battery-operated toys or otherwise, no TVs or radios that could have been in the garage. The home is in Florida, and was a new build constructed for our family. There have been no deaths in the home, and I have not found as much from researching the records of the land itself from former owners. From what I gather, it was previously just woodland. I'm 33 years old now, and still have no rational explanation. If anyone has any thoughts or suggestions, I'd be glad to hear about it. So growing up, my mum always told me to never play with a Ouija board, as they were evil, and would let in something dark. I had always listened to her because two of my aunts, one on my father's side and one on my mother's, had been followed by something dark through a part of their lives, and it made me think about how evil Ouija boards can be. When I met my current boyfriend almost 4 years ago, he told me stories about how his mum and he would play with a Ouija board, because his mum always had two certain people who would talk to her, and he had some cool experiences himself. What he didn't tell me right away was that he kept his board in the trunk of his car. A frequent smoking area we would go to would be a cemetery during the night, because you could see if someone was coming during the night. But no one ever went there at night. It was up on a hill in the back of a cemetery, where no one could see or smell a thing. One day we were smoking some weed here, and my boyfriend and his 3 friends decided to go for a walk, but I had a really bad feeling, so elected to stay in the car with the keys. I watched them walk away, and I started to feel like someone was watching me. So with how high I was, I kept checking all the mirrors I could see from the passenger seat to see if anyone was there. I decided to try and get my mind off things and check my social media. But within a few minutes the feeling intensified, and I looked up at the mirror to see a man standing maybe 10 feet away from the car. Oddly enough, he was in a black suit and top hat. I decided that it would be best to climb into the back seat and sit on the floor. The doors were already locked, and it seemed like my best option. And I could see anyone, so that's what I did. As I sat on the ground and looked up through the windshield, I could see a lady in a white dress that reminded me of early 1900s. By the time they came back, they made fun of me for being on the floor, but I couldn't tell them why. The next day, my boyfriend decided to tell me about the Ouija board in his trunk, and asked if I ever wanted to play with him. The first time I played was at his mother's house, which I've been told by a few people in the house they all believe it's haunted due to their encounters. We decided to play on the front porch after we had a cigarette, but the only thing that happened was that it said fire, and the piece moved a little closer to a space heater next to my boyfriend, causing his hand to turn really hot. The next time I played with it, it seemed kind of funny until I did it alone. My boyfriend, his friend and I were in my room smoking weed, and I said something about wanting to try it again because I believe I'm followed and wanted to know who was following me or why. And so my boyfriend ran out to his car to grab the board, and when he came back inside, he said on his way back, the street was completely empty. I lived in a neighborhood with mostly children and elders, and it being around midnight, this obviously wasn't uncommon. He heard a loud cackle in his ear, and it almost made him freeze, but he turned and there was no one there. The 3 of us decided to figure out who could play, because I believe 3 people could play where my boyfriend believed only 2 could play. We tried it my way. We all put our hands on the planchette, and almost as soon as we touched it, it moved and said 3C, and moved to a little picture at the corner of the board and said goodbye. This happened 3 times, and none of us realized until the last goodbye that it was saying 3 could play and was showing a picture of 3 people playing, 2 boys and a girl, and next to the girl's head was a spirit's face. As soon as we put 2 and 2 together, I felt the hairs start to move. We decided to play it alone, with the others watching. I know you're not supposed to, but I had some questions. It moved a little for my boyfriend, and he passed the board on to his friend where it didn't move at all. When it was passed to me, It took a minute before I started, but almost as soon as my fingers touched the planchette, I felt like something gripped my wrist very tightly, and my vision went black. I said, "Ghosty, are you there?" And the piece started to move around slightly, but wouldn't answer me clearly. It got worse as I tried to say goodbye, which I had to say 5 times until it finally gave up and said goodbye to me. The last time I saw the board was when my boyfriend and I went to my aunt's. That was a little way out of town. On the way back, we decided to take the back roads because I loved it, and we decided to stop at this little area that had a small pond. No one was there, no houses. We were just talking and decided to play a little prank on the next person wandering through the area. We went through a walk through the trees until we could no longer see our car, and set the board up like someone was going to play it. He asked if I wanted to play one more time, and I said sure. It took a little longer this time, but what was weird to me was that after it said, "Are you scared?" That's when I felt something scratch my leg, and he said the words out loud, and then we heard 3 gunshots. Deciding it was time to leave, we said goodbye, allowing it to say it back, and we left everything there and went home. I'm curious to know if anyone has ever had any experiences like I did. My stepdad worked for this company that breaks and rebuilds houses. Well, there was this old house my stepdad had been assigned to work at, and he found an old vinyl record there that we brought back home, because I have a record player and adore vintage things. I played it on my record player, and we played it no mind. The next day my stepdad came home all shaken up. We asked him what was wrong. He told us he found out from the company that the house was haunted, and that they heard noises coming from the attic, and it wasn't necessarily people but spirits. This freaked him out, as he realized he gave me a vinyl from the house. He took it and burnt it, and that is when things started to happen. My mum and stepdad would hear screaming in their ears. It got so bad my mum had to bring in a priest to bless the house. I didn't know this until later though. A couple of days after, around 4 AM, our hallway lights started dimming and flickering. It was initially off, but turned on all the way brightly, then dimmed, then went bright, and then turned back on and off again 5 times. I brushed it off, thinking it was defective, or that my stepdad may have done something childish like that. The next day I asked him if he was up at 4, and he said no, and I told him about the lights, and he genuinely looked confused, so I left it alone. A few days after that, I heard a huge knock on my side of the wall. My sister heard it as well. We freaked out because my side of the wall doesn't have another room at the end. It's outside and really high, so unless something custom made a ladder just to knock really hard on solid brick, we figured it was probably a spook. The last time something strange happened was when my baby brother was in the room, and we heard a child laughing and footsteps. I went to the room, only to find him asleep, and there was no one else in the room. Then a few weeks went by. I truly figured out nothing would happen until 2 days ago. My baby brother has this Jessie doll from Toy Story. The only way it should be able to talk is when you pull its string. Well, during the day I was teaching my baby brother the alphabet, when all of a sudden I hear Jessie's vocal box talk. At first I thought it was broken, so I dug into his toys to find all the way to the bottom. Curious, I even pulled the string. I thought it was broken and may react to pressure, so I threw it around everywhere, hit it, poked it, it did nothing. Curious, I even pulled the string and it refused to play. I thought that was really weird, so I kept it in my head. The next day, I checked it, and it didn't work. It hadn't worked for 2 days. My mum is upstairs, and my sister and I are in our bed, and my brother by my mum. My stepdad was outside shoveling, telling me when I heard Jessie's voice downstairs in the pitch-dark living room. I didn't talk once or twice, but 3 times, which is pretty creepy. After I heard footsteps creak down the stairs, when there was no one there. If anyone can give me any advice on what to do with the doll, I'd love it. On the 5th of June 2022, me and my girlfriend Tony had gone to the Isle of Wight for our holidays. I've always loved the island and have always returned to the reported most haunted island in the UK. Our holiday camp was Thorness Bay near East Cowes, which has a beautiful bay for private use. This was the location for our encounter. On June the 6th, at about 8:30, we had left our accommodation and headed down to the bay. By the time we got there it was 8:50 and dusk. We could see people in the distance as there was a campfire, but instantly we felt aware of something else. We could see a shadow a lot closer than the people by the fire. We waved and got no response. The tide was out, and me being a kid that went crabbing lifted rocks to show Tony the crabs. We had noticed the tide had turned and was coming in. While we headed back to the shore, we still had the feeling of being watched. We decided to walk along the beach to a concrete base and sat down and watched the tide come in and out as the sun went down. Then, the weirdness began. Now I'm partially hard of hearing due to spending 5 years doing artillery in my early reenactment days, so small noises have to happen right next to me in order for me to hear them at all. The sense of being watched was still high, and we started to hear movement from behind us and going past me. The sound of footsteps, to be exact. I snapped my head to the right, expecting to see a person, but there was nothing. My senses were alert again. The sounds of footsteps on a pebble beach walked right past. I turned sharply to nothing. I turned to Tony for clarification, to which she backed up what I heard. Then the final straw were the footsteps walking directly past us to the sound of pebbles being thrown. We got up and looked over our shoulders, still feeling like being watched. In World War II, East Coves was bombed heavily due to Navy shipbuilders there, and not forgetting the 6th of June, 1944 saw the biggest seaborne assault leaving the area. Perhaps it was a coincidence? A time slip from early history? Maybe someone from a shipwreck? We may never know. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so very much for listening. I love you all so much and appreciate all of you being here, so thank you. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. This was definitely a fun one to make. Double paranormal bonanza this week. Hope you liked it. I don't know what the compilation will be this Sunday, but you'll find out soon enough. Let's hope it's to your liking. I would like to offer a huge thank you to all my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for all their support of the channel. It means so much more than you can possibly imagine. Just watching my videos means the world to me, so thank you. And thank you for making it to the end. I love you, and you are amazing. But for now, it's time to say goodnight. Or watch one of these other videos on screen. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.